Oh, hi. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, I didn't see that. Sorry.
So, so the first thing, are you happy to tell us a little bit about your background, your childhood, and what sort of shaped you and your interests?
Yeah, well, it's very related to the subject of my book about depression in a way, lost connections actually, in all sorts of ways. Because I wrote the book because there were these two kind of mysteries that were hanging over me. Um, the first is that I'm 40 years old, and all throughout my life, depression and anxiety have increased in all the places that I've lived, in Britain, in the United States, in Switzerland, across the world. And I wanted to understand why. Why is this happening? Why is it that with each year that passes, more and more of us are finding it harder to get through the day? And I wanted to understand this because of a more personal reason, which is that when I was a teenager, I remember going to my doctor and explaining that I had this feeling like pain was kind of leaking out of me, and I didn't understand it. I couldn't control it. I felt quite ashamed of it. And And my doctor told me a story that I now realize was well intentioned and not 100% wrong, but was really, really oversimplified. Um, my doctor said, well, we know why people get like this. Some people just have something wrong with their brains. You're clearly one of them. All we need to do is give you these drugs and you're going to be fine. So I was given a chemical antidepressant named Paxil, or Seroxat. It's the same thing with different names. And it gave me some relief. But I became depressed again, so they gave me higher doses and higher doses until for 13 years I was taking the maximum possible dose you're allowed to take, at the end of which I still felt awful. So I ended up going on this big journey all over the world. I wanted to understand, both for myself and for the society, what was happening, right? So I went all over the world. I traveled over 40,000 miles. I met a crazy mixture of people, lots of people who are relevant to your work, from a Amish village in Indiana, because the Amish have very low levels of depression,
Yeah.
to a city in Brazil that banned advertising to see if that would make people feel better, to a lab in Baltimore where they're giving people psychedelics to see if that helped with their depression. And I learned a huge amount. But the core of what I learned is that there's scientific evidence for 9 different causes of depression and anxiety. 2 of them are indeed in our biology, but most of them are not in our biology. Most of them are factors in the way we live. And once you understand them, it opens up a very different set of solutions and a whole different way of thinking about what human beings are, which is what so much of your amazing work has been about. And in terms of where I grew up and how that affected me, I grew up in a suburb of London, kind of typical suburb of London called Edgware, which is, and I grew up in a kind of, my parents had come from quite poor backgrounds. And they were both thought of themselves as immigrants. My dad was from a tiny a mountain in Switzerland, and my mother had grown up in tenement housing in Scotland. And I say they thought of themselves as immigrants because my mother thinks of Scotland as a foreign country to London. But they had really worked unbelievably hard to get into a kind of middle class life, and I'm very grateful to them for the work that they did to get me there. But it was very interesting to me to see. I mean, I only realized this in retrospect, but the place I grew up was a place full of decent people who worked hard and are admirable people. But there was very much something, both my parents had grown up in places where there had been communities, right? My father had known everyone who lived in his village, pretty much. And my mother had known most of the people who lived in her area. And I remember when I was a baby when they moved to London. I don't remember life before that, but I remember my mother would often, when she came to live in the suburb in London, she kind of realized that you're not meant to go and talk to your neighbors. It's considered almost bad manners, right?
Yeah.
Or you can a little bit, but there's a very, very strict limit on how much you can engage with them. And I remember there were times when she would just look at our street and she would say, where is everyone?
Yeah.
Where are all the people? She could never really adjust to it because both my parents had grown up in such a different environment. And of course, to me, that just seemed, when I was young, weird, right? I didn't understand it was alien to me. their way of thinking, because it didn't fit with the reality around me. And I grew up very much in a world of consumerist values, right? And I want to stress there were lots of kind, decent people where I grew up, but the dominant values were about television and consumerism. So I remember when I was about 9 or 10 years old, in this suburb where I lived, a shopping centre, a mall opened up called the Boardwalk Centre. And I remember I just absorbed this from the culture, from advertising, thinking this was the most incredible thing, right? That there was suddenly the shopping centre, and I would wander through the shops, staring at things in this sense of awe, which of course wore off very quickly. But I remember thinking when I was a child, you know, if you had asked me what is happiness, I would have said it's being able to walk into the Boardwalk Centre and to buy anything you want, right?
Yeah.
So I was very much raised in these, in a place where there's a lot of isolation, where in fact isolation was the norm, where you were meant to, your sense of home is meant to be your house and maybe your family, and a place where the dominant values were just straightforward consumerist values. And that was where you were trained to seek happiness, right? Where do you seek happiness? You work hard at a job you don't like to buy things you don't need. That was the story about happiness that I had. And it was only kind of much later that I began to see the problems with those ways of living, I guess.
And then, so what do you think triggered that awareness? Do you remember? Or was it the depression and the drugs, or was there something else that triggered the awareness?
That's a really good question. I think a really important part of it, you know, the biggest change I made in my thinking about depression and the research for my book Lost Connections was in some ways something that seems very simple, but I found very profound. I was experiencing depression and anxiety, like actually a huge number of people in the place where I grew up and in our culture. And I was taught, not just by my doctor, but by the wider culture, to regard my depression and anxiety as malfunctions inside myself, right? As biological malfunctions.
Yeah.
And what I learned from the leading experts in the world when I interviewed them is there is a biological component to depression and anxiety, to be sure, but it's one part of a much bigger picture. And in the main, depression and anxiety are not malfunctions. They're signals, right? They're signals that are telling us something. You know, everyone knows they have natural physical needs. Obviously, you need food and water and shelter and clean air. If I took those things away from you, obviously you'd be in a lot of trouble. But there's equally strong evidence that all human beings have natural psychological needs. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning. You need to feel that people see you and value you. You need to feel you've got a future that makes sense. And this culture we built is good at lots of things. I'm glad to be alive today, but we've been getting less and less good at meeting these deep underlying psychological needs. And so I think for me, it's a curious thing, Helena, because I was experiencing these signals that my needs weren't being met, but I didn't have any way of it's worse than that. I was going to say I didn't have any way of interpreting those signals. It's worse. I had an incorrect method for interpreting those signals.
Yeah.
I'd been given the wrong story about what I felt.
Yeah.
And it's a very curious thing. A psychologist I read once said that, you know, one of the most powerful things you can ever do is give someone a narrative for their pain and distress. And if you're given a narrative that is wrong in all sorts of ways, it trains you to seek happiness in all the wrong places and meaning in all the wrong places. And so, you know, it's interesting because I was thinking about this as I was reading your work as well. There was a moment when this became completely clear to me in my research, where it's very rare you have actual epiphanies, but this was really close to an actual epiphany for me. I went to interview a wonderful South African psychiatrist. Excuse me. I went to interview a wonderful South African psychiatrist named Dr. Derek Summerfield. And he told me a story that really changed how I thought about my own depression and the depression that's been rising all around me. So he explained to me that in 2001, he happened to be in Cambodia when they first introduced chemical antidepressants for people in that country. And the local doctors, the Cambodians, had never heard of these drugs. So they were like, what are they? And he explained. And they said to him, oh, we don't need them. We've already got antidepressants. And he said, what do you mean? He thought they were going to talk about a herbal remedy, like, I don't know, St. John's wort or something. Instead, they told him a story. There was a farmer in their community who worked in the rice fields. And one day he stood on a landmine left over from the war with the United States, and he got his leg blown off. So they gave him an artificial limb, and he went back after a while, some period of rehabilitation, to work in the rice fields. But apparently it's extremely painful to work underwater when you've got an artificial leg. And I'm guessing it was, very traumatic to go and work in the field where he got blown up. The man started to cry all day. He refused to get out of bed. He was just obviously what we would call depressed. And the doctors said, this is when the Cambodians said to Dr. Summerfield, well, that's when we gave him an antidepressant. And Dr. Summerfield said, what was it? And they explained that they went and sat with him. They listened to him. They realized that his pain made sense. If you listen to him, it was perfectly understandable why he was depressed. One of them figured, if we bought this guy a cow, he could become a dairy farmer. He wouldn't be in this position that was screwing him up so much. So they bought him a cow. Within a couple of weeks, his crying stopped. Within a month, his depression was gone. They said to Dr. Summerfield, so you see, doctor, that cow, that was an antidepressant. That's what you mean, right? Now, if you've been raised to think about depression and anxiety the way we have in Western culture, that sounds like a joke, right? I went to my doctor for an antidepressant. She gave me a cow. But what those Cambodian doctors knew intuitively is what the leading medical body in the whole world, the World Health Organization, has been trying to tell us for years. If you're depressed, if you're anxious, you're not weak, you're not crazy, you're not a machine, not in the main, a machine with broken parts. You're a human being with unmet needs. And what you need is love and help and support to get those deeper needs met. So I think we need to really transform our understanding of what depression and anxiety are, and then radically expand our idea of what an antidepressant is. Anything that reduces depression should be regarded as an antidepressant. For some people, for some time, that will include drugs, and that has value. But precisely because this problem goes so much deeper than our biology, we need to find solutions that go much deeper than our biology too.
One of the reasons I'm so motivated to get out this message about a structural economic part that helps us to connect in an interdependent way in more human scale structures is also just this, aching, sadness at how many people around the world are made to feel that they are the idiots, that they are wrong. And you see this, so what I see everywhere in the world is self-blame, because this message that's going out about how to be happy, and not just about how to be happy, but who you should be, to have the respect that everybody deserves, to be seen, to be valued, to be connected. The message now, literally, globally, is you've got to look like a successful urban Western consumer. You've got to be successful, and that means really good job, meaning lots of money. And all the time, the messaging is also you've got to live in the urban centers of the world, which of course is where the jobs are concentrated. So it's so tragic to see literally in every country I know of, and we've worked in, about a dozen countries, we've had connection with, 50 language groups, and literally around the world, there's this epidemic of depression and anxiety on the increase in every single country. I know of no exception, and yet the narrative remains very local, very within the national boundaries, but still constructed by global media. And that message means that people blame themselves, the parents blame themselves, and they blame their own politicians, they blame their own government. They're not looking at essentially a corporate consumer culture agenda that means that the way we calculate growth increases with these illnesses. It is such a tragedy. And above all, it's so tragic to see when people don't realize that this is an epidemic everywhere. They tend, as I say, to blame themselves and to blame their own perhaps their own cultural heritage, their own politicians, but they just don't see the bigger picture. So this is what our work is all about, is trying to provide that bigger picture.
I think you're totally right. And there's an aspect of the bigger picture that I learned about. It goes back to that experience I had about the mall, actually, when I was a teenager. It made me reflect again on that when I was a child. So one of the causes of depression and anxiety that I learned about that I found most challenging for the book was what I learned from an amazing man. So for thousands of years, philosophers have said, you know, if you think life is about money and status and showing off, you're going to feel like shit, right? That's not an exact quote from Confucius, but that's basically what he said.
Absolutely.
But actually, nobody had scientifically investigated this in a kind of empirical way until this amazing man named Professor Tim Kasser, who's at Knox College in Illinois, who I should love to put you in touch with if you've not met him, because he's
I would love to.
him. You'd absolutely love him. I'm just going to write that down. So Professor Kasser was the first person to really scientifically investigate this, and he made a series of, well, a huge number of breakthroughs, but I'll just tell you the headlines. So the first was, he discovered that the philosophers were right, that the more you think life is about money and status and showing off, the more depressed and anxious you'll become. He also showed, as a society, as a culture, we have become much more driven by this way of thinking. And the way I started to think about it was, everyone knows junk food has taken over our diets and made us physically sick. But our kind of junk values have taken over our minds and made us mentally sick. Just like everyone needs nutrition, obviously. And what junk food does is it appeals to the part of us that needs nutrition, but actually makes us sick. In the same way, everyone needs a system of values to guide them through life, obviously. And what these junk values do is they tell you, oh, this is how you guide yourself through life. But they actually train you to seek happiness in all the wrong places. There's a little experiment that I think illustrates this so well. It was done in 1978, not by Professor Kasser, by a different team. And it's a very simple experiment. They got a bunch of 5-year-olds and they split them into 2 groups. And the first group was shown no advertisements. And the second group was shown 2 advertisements for a popular toy at the time, whatever the equivalent of Dora the Explorer or the Teletubbies was in 1978, I forget what it was. And then all the kids are given a choice. They say, okay, kids, now you can play with one of 2 children. You can either play with this nice boy who doesn't have any toys, or you can play with a nasty boy who's got the toy that was in the advertisement. The kids who hadn't seen the advertisement overwhelmingly chose to play with the nice boy. They chose the human connection. The kids who'd seen just 2 advertisements overwhelmingly chose the nasty boy who got the toy, or who had the toy, right? So what this shows us is just exposure to 2 advertisements trained these kids to prefer an object, a lump of plastic, over fun, connection, you know, enjoyment, right? And I think, you know, in a little small way, that illustrates what's happened to the whole culture, right? Everyone sees more than 2 advertisements a day now, right? From the moment, I mean, more 18-month-old children in the United States know what the McDonald's M means than know their own last name.
Yeah.
So we're immersed from the moment we're born in this machinery. The way Professor Kasser put it to me is, we live in a machine that is designed to get us to neglect what is important about life. It's a very profound and challenging insight. So I think about myself as a little boy, right? Being trained to think happiness is walking around this shopping mall and being able to buy everything. Even though at some level I knew, well, the times when I could go into a shopping mall and buy something, the happiness lasted for a very short period of time, right? We've all had that experience. You go and buy something expensive, you get a rush, and then you get home and you just feel terrible again, right? And these insights are just beneath the surface. This is one of the most interesting bits of research that Professor Kasser did. He teamed up with a guy called Nathan Dungham and did a really simple little experiment. So Nathan is a financial advisor in Minneapolis. And one day he got called in by a school. So his job was to advise people on budgeting, doing their family budget, that sort of thing. And he got called by a school. It was kind of middle-class school. And they said, look, we've got a problem. The kids at our school are becoming obsessed with getting the latest sneakers, the latest iPhone, whatever it be. And they're really getting angry and panicked and anxious when they can't get these things. And it's causing a lot of problems. Could you come in and advise them on like budgeting so that, you know, they'll understand that their parents can't afford it?
Yeah.
So he came in and he talks to the kids, and he quickly realizes these kids don't give a shit about budgeting, right? That there's something else going on here that's deeper than they don't understand that their parents don't have the money. So they decided, he teamed up with Professor Casa, and they did this really interesting research. It's very simple, and I recommend people do this themselves. They just got a group together of teenagers and their parents to meet once every, I think it was once every few weeks for a few months. And the first meeting they had, they just said to them, they didn't give them much guidance. They just said, I just want you to make a list of all the things you've got to have. They didn't tell them what that meant. And of course, at first people said, you know, you need a home, you need food and things. But quite quickly, people named things you really don't have to have, like the latest Nike sneakers, or the parents would name a handbag, a fancy car, whatever it would be. And they'd said to the group, well, okay, let's imagine that tomorrow you got this thing. You got the Nike sneakers, you got the handbag, you got the car. How would your life be different? And very quickly, it's interesting, almost nobody mentioned the kind of ostensible purpose of the object, right? They didn't go, oh, well, I want to play basketball and I'll be able to jump higher, right? No one said that. They said things like, well, people would envy me, or I would be accepted by the group, right? It doesn't take long to get people to say that out loud before you go, where did you get the idea that you would have worth because you bought a piece of plastic, right? So people, even just getting them to say these values out loud, got them to take it apart. But the next thing they did in the group, which was even more interesting, is they got people to talk about, okay, what are moments in your life when you did feel meaning and purpose? When you did feel, you know, either meaningful or happy, or, and you know, different people named different things. Some people it was playing the piano or running on the beach or whatever it was. And then the group started talking about, okay, how could you build more of your life around pursuing these moments of meaning and purpose, and less around these, you know, buying the things that you can see don't make you feel good. What was interesting is just having these conversations and checking in with each other, they measured their values, led to a marked shift in the values of these people. It was like a kind of Alcoholics Anonymous for consumerism, right? And we know that those shifts in values lead to a reduction in depression and anxiety. And to me, that what's so important about that is, because what you're saying and what Professor Cass is saying cuts with the grain of human nature, right? And this system cuts against the grain of human nature. It actually, these insights are just beneath the surface.
Absolutely. And this is also what we find, is that particularly women respond by saying, oh, you put words to what I always felt, but I couldn't articulate so clearly. And there's definitely a bit of a gender difference there, that women tend to be a little bit more sensitive to their own emotions than the emotions of others. But I also want to ask you, that last experiment, what year was that? Do you know when they did that?
They were doing that in the correct date is in the book. I think it's the early 2000s. It's not that long ago. It's about 10, 15 years ago.
Because one of the things that I think we have to think about is, first of all, why the pressures, the commercial pressures, have increased so dramatically in the last 30 years. And also why experiments like that are not reaching the wider world. You know, there were people like Eric Fromm who was writing along in a similar vein, but those voices generally just don't get out. In the last 30 years, this is what we've witnessed, is progressively a burying of all those messages that could help people move in the opposite direction, away from consumerism. And it's this tragic, from my point of view, it's a tragic structural conspiracy where narrow, over-specialized science linked to larger and larger scale economic units, essentially to giant corporations, and where more and more of the research is often unconsciously serving this really rather evil agenda. And
I think that's really well put,
yeah,
and I think it's really well put, and I think actually Noam Chomsky, who we both admire,
yeah,
in a way you have to use some of his analysis to think about this. But I think you're right. If you look at the origins of psychology as an academic discipline, for example, right? So psychology is created as an academic discipline in the United States. I mean, there have been some people who would be regarded as psychologists in Germany, but the psychology is created as an modern academic discipline in the United States, explicitly by people who want to figure out, how do you make workers more productive in factories? That's the origin of it, right? It's Fordist production. And very much academic psychology has been shaped unconsciously by these capitalist values ever since. I'll give you an interesting example that I think people can really see. You can see how often these things are presented as neutral science, but are in fact carriers of capitalist values. I'll give you a good example. In the 1970s, the American Psychiatric Association decided that for the first time, they were going to standardize how they defined depression. Because up to then, doctors were just calling anything they wanted depression, right? So they decided we're going to define depression properly. So they wrote a fairly basic definition, and it's things people could guess. They drew up a checklist of 10 symptoms, things like crying a lot, feeling life isn't worth living. And they said to psychiatrists, if any of your patients have more than 6 of these 10 symptoms for more than 2 weeks, you should diagnose them as mentally ill and do what you can to help them. So this checklist is sent out to psychiatrists all over the United States. But within a few months, some of them start to come back and go, look, we've got a bit of a problem here. If we use this checklist the way you've told us to, we're going to have to define every grieving person as mentally ill because these are the symptoms of grief, right? And the American Psychiatric Association said, oh shit, that's not what we meant, right? We didn't mean that. So they invented what became known as the grief loophole. They said, okay, if any of your patients have more than 6 of these 10 symptoms for more than 2 weeks, define them as mentally ill, unless someone they love has died in the last year, in which case they're not crazy, they're not mentally ill, you shouldn't give them any treatment, right? But so psychiatrists started applying that, but then that begged the obvious question, why is someone you love dying the only reason where you're allowed to feel really bad and not be classed as mentally ill? Why not if you've lost your job? Why not if you're stuck in a job you hate for the next 40 years? Why not if you've been made homeless? We can all think of immediate examples, right? And you can see how these, what appears to be a neutral science is in fact based on these profoundly capitalist values. Because if you allow all of that context into psychiatry, then you start diagnosing the society, not the individual, right? Actually, why have we got a society where so many people are unhappy? It can, and also bear in mind, particularly in the United States, if you're classed as mentally ill, you're given permission to not work for a short period, right? And that you've got to very tightly delimit in a capitalist system the number of people who are not allowed to not work. So you can see how this kind of, no, they need to get back to work. You're not happy with your job? That's not a legitimate reason to feel terrible. Get back to work, right? So you can see how these values, and by the way, the American Psychiatric Association is saying even worse, which is because people challenged it, they gradually reduced the amount of time you were allowed to be grieving. When they started, it was a year, but employers were pissed off about that. We can't have people off work for a year. So they reduced it until they reduced it in the end down to 2 weeks. And then, so they got rid of it entirely. So now, if you're still depressed 2 weeks after your baby died, you know, well, then you're mentally ill, you need to be drugged, you need to be pathologized, you need to be categorized as mentally ill. So I think you're right that what we've had, one of the reasons, we're in a weird situation. This isn't like explaining Chomskyan linguistics or quantum physics to people, right? It's not complicated. People get it immediately when you talk to them about it. But we're in this weird situation where what we are saying to people, you and I and the many people who share this perspective, is both obvious and deeply challenging and revolutionary, right? Which is a sign of how awry the culture has gone. There's a great quote, Krishnamurti, the great Indian philosopher, said, it's no sign of good health to be well adjusted to a sick society.
Very, very good. Absolutely.
You know,
but you know, also when you say in this capitalist system, I want to explain why I don't use that language, because very often on the left in the Anglo world, Scandinavia is held up as this sort of nice balance, you know, and communism has probably been, you know, sort of lost its sort of status. But from my point of view, you know, in that socialist system and in the communist, as well as the capitalist, there are other issues at play which have to do with industrialism, fueled by so-called cheap fossil fuels. It's to do with centralized top-down structures that become monocultural, that become an imposition, and that strangle real human interdependence, which I see as the cornerstone for well-being. You know, that I often use the example of a friend of mine in Sweden who did this study, knowing that the question was, does higher education lead to greater self-esteem? She knew, as a sociologist, that the answer wasn't going to be yes. But what she discovered, she hadn't expected. And what she found was that what did lead to higher self-esteem was a larger number of significant others in your life. And the most depressed people with the lowest self-esteem were the ones who said nobody. And so that again is, leads me on to say also why I loved your description of the sort of solutions where people were brought together in a group and not only connected to each other with the deeper sharing, the vulnerability, the exposure of vulnerability that helped them to connect as genuine, feeling human beings, not as show off, we're totally happy, we don't need anybody, and this sort of show off conversation, which has become a need in people who have been formed by this idea that in order to be admired, in order to belong, which is what every child longs for, and every human being longs for, is to feel affirmed, to feel loved and connected. But we've been told that the way to get that is through looking the right thing, having the right car. So this essentially, we've been led down a path of envy, competition, and separation, and been told that it's going to lead to the connection we want. But anyway, so I loved your story.
I think that's really important what you just said, and I think you're on the capitalism point. I think you're totally right that some people have a narrow understanding of the problem. So I would argue there are many social configurations that don't meet people's deeper needs.
Yeah.
One is contemporary capitalism. Definitely another one was the Soviet Union, which was even worse, right? Where, I mean, people were unbelievably miserable and drinking themselves to death. And, absolutely. So you can get into a kind of simplistic binary where people think if you're critiquing the contemporary capitalist system, you're proposing these even worse and more horrific models, which are not just worse for individual psychological needs, but actually worse for the environment. And I mean, just a horror show beyond words. So I think that's a really important clarification. But I also think you're totally right about these programs. And as you were saying, so I was thinking about another person I'm very happy to introduce you to, you'd love, who one of the heroes of my book is an amazing man named Dr. Sam Everington. So he's a general practitioner in East London. And Sam was really uncomfortable. He's a poor part of East London where I lived for many years. And Sam was really uncomfortable because he had loads of patients coming to him who had just terrible depression and anxiety. And like me, he's not opposed to chemical antidepressants. Thinks they have some role to play. But he could see two things. Firstly, that his patients were depressed and anxious for perfectly understandable reasons in the vast majority of cases, like they were really lonely and or financially insecure. And secondly, he could see that chemical antidepressants gave them a bit of relief, but didn't actually solve the problem for most of them. So one day he had this idea to try something different. A patient came to his practice called Lisa Cunningham, who I got to know later. And Lisa had been shut away in her home with just crippling depression for 7 years. She barely left the house. And Sam said to Lisa, don't worry, I'll carry on giving you these drugs. I'd also like you to try something else. I'd like to come and meet a couple of times a week here at the doctor's practice, to meet with a group of other depressed and anxious people, not to talk about how bad you feel. I mean, you can do that if you want, but I want you to find something you can do together that would be meaningful. So the first time the group met, Lisa literally vomited with anxiety. It was just so much for her. But there was an area behind the doctor's surgery that was just scrubland. And they started talking, and these are inner city East London people who didn't know anything about gardening, but they were like, we could turn this into a garden. That'd be a nice thing to do. So they started to get books out of the library. They started to watch clips on YouTube about gardening. And they started to get their fingers in the soil. They started to learn the rhythms of the seasons. They started to reconnect with the natural world. They've been cut off from it for a very long time. There's a lot of evidence that interacting with the natural world is a profoundly healing antidepressant.
Absolutely.
And they started to form a tribe. They started to form a group, right? They started to care about each other. If one of them didn't show up, the others would go looking for them, figure out what was going on, help them solve their problem. The way Lisa put it to me, as the garden began to bloom, we began to bloom. There was a study in Norway of a very similar program that found it was more than twice as effective as chemical antidepressants. I think for an obvious reason, right? And this is something I saw all over the world in my research, from Sydney to San Francisco to Sao Paulo. The most effective strategies for dealing with depression and anxiety are the ones that deal with the reasons why we're depressed and anxious in the first place. They're the ones that respect the signal, that listen to the signal and solve the underlying problem. What we've been doing up to now, way too much of the time, is pathologizing the signal and insulting the signal and saying it's a sign of weakness, or it's a sign of craziness, or it's purely a biological malfunction, when in fact that's a way too simplistic a way of understanding what this problem is, and it leads us therefore to find the wrong. If you don't have an accurate map, you can't find your way through the territory, right? And because we've given people an inaccurate map of their problem, or a very limited map of their problem, it's not totally inaccurate. There are some biological contributions. It's always important to stress that. But you know, we've neglected the real. We've neglected to explain the real problem.
We're seeing localization as this healing path, a structural path that would enable the majority of human beings to have that foundation of human scale structures, human scale community, and connection to the living world. It would be far cheaper, it would be far easier to shift the current system where taxes, subsidies, and regulations are pushing us in exactly the opposite direction. If governments can be made to shift to support human beings and to support their well-being and the well-being of the planet, and with it, reduce dramatically the gap between rich and poor, with it, restore some hope of genuine democracy. Anyway, so everything you say just fits right into supporting everything that we're trying to promote.
You know, there's an example of a place, you know, I think you can tell from the way I talk about it that I learned a lot from scientists and doctors in my journey to write Lost Connections. But actually, the people who taught me the most about this subject were not scientists and doctors. It was a group of people who I think really fit with your thesis very powerfully. And if it's okay, I'll just tell you their story. So in the summer of 2011, on a big anonymous housing project in Berlin, a Turkish-German woman named Nuria Cengiz climbed out of her wheelchair and she put a sign in her window. Nuria lived on the ground floor, and the sign said something like, "I got a notice saying I'm going to be evicted from my apartment next Thursday, so on Wednesday night, I'm going to kill myself." Now, this housing project is a place called Kotti. It's a very poor part of Berlin. And for a long time, basically only three groups of people had lived there. There were recent Muslim immigrants like this woman, Nuria. There were gay men, and there were punk squatters. And as you can imagine, these three groups did not get along, but no one knew anyone. It was a completely isolated place, a huge amount of depression and anxiety. And people started to walk past Nuria's window. No one knew her, and they saw this sign. And people knocked on her door, and they said, "Oh, do you need any help?" And Nuria said, "No, fuck you, I don't want any help, I'm going to kill myself." Right? Now, in this, like in the whole of Berlin, in this housing project, there had been rising rents for a really long time. A lot of people were being evicted. So a lot of people, you know, really identified with this woman's struggle. And people started talking outside her apartment one day, and they had an idea. There's a big thoroughfare that goes through this housing project, through Kotti. And they had this idea, you know, if we just block the road for a day and we have a protest, there'll be a bit of a fuss. They'll probably let Nuria stay. There might even be some pressure to keep our rents down across the city, right? Or on our housing project. So Saturday came, they blocked the road. They wheeled Nuria out. She said, "Well, I'm going to kill myself. I might as well let these people push me into the middle of the street." And they had a protest, and the media did come, and it was a bit of a news event in Berlin that day. And then it got to the end of the day, and the police said to them, "Okay, you've had your fun, take it down, right? Take this barricade down." And the people who lived at Kotti said, "Well, you haven't told Nuria she gets to stay. Actually, we'll take this barricade down when Nuria gets a guarantee she can stay and we get a rent freeze for our entire housing project." But of course they knew the minute they walked away from this barricade, the police would just tear it down and that would be the end of it. So one of my favorite people at Kotti, a woman called Tanya Gartner, who's one of the punk squatters, she wears tiny little miniskirts even in Berlin winters. Tanya had an idea. She went up to her apartment and she had a klaxon, you know, those things that make loud noises at soccer matches.
Yeah.
Came down, she said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to draw up a timetable to man this barricade 24 hours a day until we've got, guarantee Nuri gets to stay, we've got a rent freeze for all of us. And we're not going to stop until we've got what we demand, right? So people start signing up to man this barricade, people who would never have met. So Tanya, in her tiny little punk miniskirt, got paired up with Nuria, who's a very religious Muslim in a full hijab.
Mm.
And they got, if I remember right, they got the Thursday night shifts. And the first few nights they sit there, they were like, this is awful. We've got nothing to talk about. We couldn't have less in common. This is terrible. As the nights went on, Tanya and Nuria started talking. They realized they had something incredibly powerful in common.
Mm.
Nuria had come to Berlin when she was 15 years old from a village in Turkey, 16 years old, with two small babies. And she was meant to earn enough money to send back home for her husband in Turkey to come and join her.
Mm.
And she was there for a year and a half. She worked every job she could. She was looking after her babies as best she could. And then sitting there in the cold in Kotti with Tanya, she told her something she'd never told anyone in Germany before. She'd always told people that her husband, she got word then that her husband in Turkey had died of a heart attack. In fact, she told Tanya he died of tuberculosis, which was seen as like a shameful disease of poverty at that time. That's when Tanya told Nuria something she never talked about. Tanya had come to Kotti when she was 15, even younger than Nuria. She'd been thrown out by her middle-class family because they thought it was insane that she loved punk. She made her way, she lived in a squat in Kotti, and she got pregnant not long after she arrived. So they realized, Tanya and Nuria, that they were incredibly similar. They had both been children who'd had children of their own in this place they didn't understand. These pairings were happening all over Kotti, right? There was a grumpy old white guy called Dieter who was paired with a young Turkish-German lad called Mehmet, who kept being told he'd nearly be thrown out of school because they said he had ADHD, and Dieter started helping Mehmet with his schoolwork. Directly opposite this housing project, there's a gay club that had opened about a year and a half before the protest called Zudblock, which is a quite kind of hardcore gay club. It's an area with a lot of religious Muslims. When this gay club was open, some people were really angry. Some people had smashed their windows. When the protest began, this club gave all their furniture to the protest, the barricade. And after going on for about 6 months, they said, you guys should have your meetings in our club. We'll give you free drinks, we'll give you free food. And even the lefties at Kotti said, we're not going to get these very religious Muslims to come and have meetings in a very extreme gay club.
Yeah. But
it did start to happen. One of the Turkish-German women there said to me, we all realized we had to take these small steps to understand each other. And after the protest had been going on for a full year, the barricade was manned every minute. One day, a guy turned up at Kotti named Tunkai, who had clearly been living homeless. Tunkai was in his early 50s. And when you meet Tunkai, it's clear that he's got some kind of cognitive difficulties. But he had an amazing energy. He was really warm and funny, and people really loved him. And by this time, they had actually, because a lot of the people at Kotti are construction workers, they'd actually built, their barricade was a permanent structure in the middle of the road with a roof. It's really lovely. And they said to Tunkai after a while, we don't want you to be homeless. You should come and live in this thing we've built. We love you. We think you're great. So Tunkai came to live there. And after he'd been there, and he became a much loved part of the Kotti protest. And after he'd been there for about, I think it was 9 months, one day, the police came to inspect. They would do this every now and then. And Tunkai doesn't like it when people argue. So he went to try to hug one of the police officers, but they thought he was attacking them. So they arrested him. That was when it was discovered. Tunkai had been shut away in a psychiatric hospital for 20 years, often literally in a padded cell. One day he had escaped. He'd been on the streets for a few months and he'd found his way to Kotti. So the police took him back to this psychiatric hospital at the other side of Berlin. At which point the entire Kotti protest turned into a kind of free Tunkai movement, right? They descended on this psychiatric hospital. And I remember these psychiatrists being like, what is this? They've got this person they've had shut away for 20 years,
Yeah.
and suddenly they've got these women in hijabs, these very camp gay men and these punks
Yeah.
demanding his release. But one of the
Yeah.
people there, one of the protesters, Uli Hartman, said to the psychiatrist, yeah, but you don't love him.
Oh.
He doesn't belong
Yeah.
with you. We love him. He belongs with us. I remember thinking, when I heard that, how many of us, if we were carried away to a psychiatric hospital, would have hundreds of people saying, no, we look after this person. You don't do
Yeah.
that, right?
Yeah.
And I remember, anyway, lots of things happened at Kotti. They got Tunkai back. It took a while. They got a rent freeze for their entire housing project. They then launched a referendum initiative to freeze rents in Berlin. It got the largest number of written signatures in the history of the city of Berlin.
Yeah.
Berlin now has a rent freeze. But
Yeah.
the last time I saw Nuria, I remember her saying to me, you know, I'm really glad I got to stay in my neighborhood. That's great. But I gained so much more than that. I was surrounded by these amazing people all along, and I would never have known. And I remember one of the Turkish German women there who was a big part of the protest, Neriman Tanker, said to me, you know, when I grew up in Turkey, I grew up in a village, and I called my whole village home. And then I came to live in the Western world. I learned that here, what you're meant to call home is just your four walls. And if you're lucky, your family. And she said, when this protest began, she started to call all these people in this whole place her home. She realized that in some sense, in this culture, we are homeless. Our sense of home isn't big enough to meet. You know, there's a wonderful Bosnian writer, Alexander Heyman, who said, home is where people notice when you're not there. And by that standard, we are homeless in this culture.
Yeah.
And to me, it was so clear to me in Kotti, these people, think about how unhappy they were, right? Nuria was about to kill herself. Tunkai was shut away in a padded cell. Mehmet was about to be thrown out of school for having ADHD. Loads of these people were depressed and anxious. In the main, they didn't need to be drugged.
Yeah.
They needed to be together.
Yeah.
They needed to be seen and valued. They needed to have a sense of purpose and meaning. And when you discover, and you're exactly right, that can only happen at the local level, right? Now, that at the local level, you can make bigger changes. And at Kotti, they were a key part of what led to the change in the whole of Berlin, getting rent freezes, which is inspiring a movement all over Europe. So, you know, the local can inspire the global. But if it hadn't been for that local reconnection with literally the people around them, I don't think that could have happened. And to me, that was a real illustration of the power of the local, right? And the power of being seen by the people around you.
Yes.
And you know, I think you can tell that I love these people in Kotti. I think they're amazing. But in many ways, they're not exceptional, right? They are random people. They were just expressing the deepest needs of human beings and finding ways to get those needs met.
I also just want to stress that, you know, that village in Turkey and the villages around the world that I've experienced are not what they could be, because these rural communities all around the world have been marginalized for generations. They've been disempowered, they've been made to feel stupid and backward, they've been left behind. All the resources have gone into the big city, where life becomes faster and faster and more anonymous. So I want people to be aware that the potential for a real genuinely prosperous and rich and rewarding way of life is much greater than what you do find in those traditional communities. And I would point to some of what I call the new local, where people are actually consciously choosing to rebuild the fabric, and where we have many examples, for instance, of the communities that were quite prejudiced against Muslims too, but then, you know, the Muslim shopkeeper in the local area, where people actually get to know Ahmed and know him as a human being. These concepts of, oh, Muslims are this way or that way, fall away. They don't always fall away overnight, and they don't always, you know, lead to total love and connection. But it's really important that we reassess this idea that what we now have to do is to develop this sense of empathy with the entire human race, this sense of empathy and concern about everything that lives. Let's not move into that intellectual and very false view, because by eroding and destroying genuine face-to-face relationship and real interdependence, the type of care that can only happen when you see each other, when you know each other. And you're talking about experiential knowledge. It's a type of total knowledge. This is not just some left brain idea. This is the reality. That's when you create the foundations for people who are healthy and strong enough, have enough self-esteem to genuinely be open to and have respect for diversity, and also will, you know, as it were, conceptually love all of humanity, will conceptually be aware that all life is interconnected, you know, which was true in most traditional spiritual traditions, you know, throughout the ages. The same messages that told us, you know, if you strive for wealth, if you strive to be better than your neighbors, if everything is based on comparison in that way, you'll be forever unhappy. You know, this is also true in Buddhism. So that those teachings were there, but they were reinforcing a way of life where that deep interdependent community was a fact, and where the deep interdependence with nature was a fact. And then these teachings help to reinforce that. So what we so badly need today is, you know, what I'm saying is we need an updated spiritual, if you like, teaching that does not take community and a type of embeddedness in the natural world for granted, and only talks about the intellectual, the theories of how to keep that sense of wonder and awe and sense of wonder. Anyway,
I think that's so important.
Yeah.
That's so important. And I think in the same way that those Buddhist ideas were almost like the formalization of the practice of living in embedded communities, as I understand it, in a much more disturbing way, and I want to phrase this carefully, but Donald Trump is an expression of the sickness of the culture, right? Now, Donald Trump is the worst of the culture. There's a lot of positive aspects in our culture, but I think Trump can be a confronting moment for us, and the problem goes much deeper than Trump. But in a sense, if you look at Donald Trump, who's a very extreme expression of what we've been talking about, profoundly lonely person, has no friends, right? Literally no friends. A person who, in one sense, on his terms, has won the game, right? He's the most powerful person in the world. He owns golden towers all over the world, and yet is as unhappy a person as you will ever see, as you can see just by looking at him, right? And it's very revealing that and I must stress again, Trump is a very extreme manifestation of this. He's not the norm. But the fact that this society has produced Trump, just like the fact that an embedded healthy community produced those Buddhist ideas, is not a coincidence. The fact that this society's produced Trump Trump is like a horrific mirror into which we can look to see, okay, this is where these values, this is what these values have produced, right? And it really should be a chance for us to step back and say, okay, we really need to choose a different path, because this is where that path will take us, right?
And also you just said path now, and I think so it's not just values, it's the structures that have created such insecurity, that have, you know, foisted these images on children, that this is the way to get the love and approval, when it actually leads to separation and envy.
Absolutely.
And then this fear of not succeeding, because if you don't succeed in that system, you can just fall to the bottom and have absolutely nothing, because everything depends on that money and on that ability to pay on your own for all your needs. So broken down any fabric of real connection, concern, community, and no social, you know, no sort of safety net. So you're creating, you know, the most horrendous fear and competition. And out of that, you know, what I'm regularly trying to explain is that when you rob men of the ability to provide for themselves and their families, and you rob them of their self-respect and their identity, it's a recipe for violence. It's a recipe for the most hideous abuses, even within their own communities, but also for this sort of fear and fundamentalism that lies behind so much of what's happening in the world today. And that's to do with a structural part that's dividing rich from poor, and where literally the majority is having to work harder and harder just to stay in place.
This has been great. Thank you. I
Yeah.
really enjoyed this. So let's
Me
speak again
too.
soon.
Yeah, thank you.
Fabulous.
Thank you.